A single aircraft forced the entire world to doubt the laws of physics and the sanity of its own generals. They called it a hoax, an impossible phantom, sheer madness. But it existed. It flew, and it ruthlessly turned everything that tried to stand in its way into a pile of scrap metal. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero, an apparatus that did not just get ahead of its time, it broke the spine of great power aviation. But the most terrifying truth is hidden not in its skin, but in the nightmarish conditions under which it was born. Today, we will dismantle this Zero down to the last rivet. I promise you facts that will make your blood run cold and that you will not find in any history textbook. Stay until the very end, and you will learn the monstrous price paid for this perfection. The truth has been hidden for too long, but the time has come to speak it. The world of the 1930s was an exclusive, tightly closed club where a handful of smug industrial giants dictated the rules of the game. All global aviation of that era was arrogantly and categorically divided into two completely unequal categories. The first category belonged to the recognized hegemons, Europe and America, boasting their colossal production facilities, century-old traditions, and armies of overfed engineers. These monopolists sincerely believed that celestial dominance belonged to them by right of birth, assuming they could endlessly dictate their terms to the rest of the planet. Into the second category, Western strategists dismissively dumped absolutely everyone else, forever assigning them the pathetic role of technological outsiders. London, Washington, and Paris committed an unforgivable mistake by mindlessly tossing ambitious Japan into this sprawling list of presumed losers. Western newspapermen caricatured this country as a backward Asian province filled with cheap paper lanterns and flimsy wooden carts. The highbrow experts from renowned Western design bureaus openly and loudly mocked any attempts by their Eastern colleagues to assemble anything more complex than an ordinary bicycle. This relates to that very blinding institutional arrogance that invariably precedes global historical catastrophes and the crushing collapse of great empires. In reality, the Japan of those years was a maximally compressed, red-hot steel spring, ready to uncoil at any second with unprecedented destructive force. In just a few decades, this power had made a simply unthinkable leap, skipping the path from forged samurai swords directly to roaring steam turbines and heavy armored dreadnoughts. The country was rapidly and aggressively building its muscles, converting every available resource into high-octane fuel for an impending industrial triumph. Young, incredibly knowledge-hungry Japanese engineers landed en masse at the best universities in Europe and America, masterfully pretending to be humble students. They greedily absorbed advanced science, took notes in classified lectures, stood near the assembly lines of Western factories, and scanned every process with photographic precision. This was not just a routine student internship, it was a massive and brilliantly planned intellectual expansion. Having studied every single screw of the highly praised Western technological thought, they returned home with one cold, crystal-clear idea. They would do all of this exponentially better. Meanwhile, Western conglomerates sluggishly continued to stamp out massive flying fortresses, reveling in their illusory superiority and completely failing to notice the ground catching fire right beneath their feet. They blatantly ignored the glaring fact that across the ocean, a completely new engineering school was being built, absolutely stripped of moldy bureaucratic blinders and outdated stereotypes. Inside the secret workshops of the Eastern Empire, furious work was already boiling that would very soon turn Western blueprints into hopelessly outdated scrap metal. The proud European and American lords of aviation did not even suspect that a final, unappealable verdict had already been issued against their unshakable monopoly. This relates to the classic scenario of a technological coup. While the well-fed and self-assured leader enjoys a peaceful slumber, an instrument of harsh retribution is forged in Spartan conditions on the other side of the world. The confrontation was absolutely inevitable, and it was ripening not on soft diplomatic parquets, but in humming factory hangars where red-hot metal merged with a fanatical idea of supremacy. The illusion of Western safety was rapidly melting away with each passing day, bringing the climax closer. The world rolled inexorably toward the day when the skies would be torn apart by the deafening roar of engines from those very machines that, according to all Western calculations, officially could not even exist. Inside the bowels of the Imperial fleet, a furious, deeply hidden cabinet war was boiling. The moss-covered admirals, deeply in love with the heavy armor of lumbering battleships, demanded the creation of a massive flying tank. They wanted to see a clumsy monster in the sky, capable of withstanding a hail of anti-aircraft shells. But they were audaciously opposed by a young, aggressive cast of naval aviators who thirsted for absolute air superiority. They needed the maneuverability of a razor, capable of slicing the sky in half. This fierce dispute tore the headquarters apart until the command slammed their fist on the table in 1937. An official memorandum was issued that forever overturned the rules of the game in military engineering. The General Staff formulated a technical specification for the creation of a fundamentally new carrier-based fighter. When this top-secret folder was placed on the table before the Empire's best aviation designers, a dead, ringing silence hung in the spacious hall. No one dared to make a sound, staring at these insane, detached from reality demands. It seemed that the headquarters strategists had simply lost their minds, writing down a feverish delirium on paper. This refers to those very historical moments when bureaucrats demand that science perform a genuine miracle on a strict schedule. Just think about these fantastic figures, which would make any specialist's hair stand on end. The speed had to exceed 500 kilometers per hour at cruising altitude. The flight range was set at a crazy mark of almost 3,000 kilometers without the use of additional drop tanks. Unheard of audacity. And as if that were not enough, the admirals, obsessed with the idea of total supremacy, demanded to cram heavy, crushing weaponry into this machine. How, pray tell, was this metal-overloaded arsenal supposed to take off and land on a short, swaying wooden aircraft carrier deck? One of the most respected engineers in the country, turning pale, slammed the ill-fated folder shut with a sweeping gesture. He looked around at his speechless colleagues and threw a harsh, ruthless verdict right in their faces. He declared that this project was a brazen slap in the face to all the laws of aerodynamics, and that its realization was physically impossible. You cannot pack a gigantic fuel reserve and cannons into one light airframe and force it to fly faster than the wind. His colleagues nodded gloomily, their slide rules smoking from tension, but the mathematics stubbornly showed a big fat zero. With the existing global technologies, it was absolutely unrealistic to fulfill this ultimatum simultaneously on all points. This refers to that very fatal line beyond which even the most brilliant minds of a generation surrender. The entire elite of Japanese aircraft manufacturing signed away their own powerlessness that day, acknowledging the unconditional victory of the immutable laws of physics. The project was already about to be thrown into the trash bin of history, like another whim of generals detached from the sky. But in the far corner of this smoke-filled office sat a man who did not even think of panicking. He was already sharpening his pencil to audaciously challenge nature itself. In that very tobacco-scented office, where the finest minds of the empire admitted their own complete powerlessness, sat a man made of entirely different clay. While the venerable gray-haired experts hid their eyes in panic and folded their useless calculations with trembling hands, Jiro Horikoshi coolly sharpened his wooden pencil. He had absolutely no intention of surrendering to the rigid laws of aerodynamics. He intended to ruthlessly rewrite them from scratch. This audacious, highly ambitious rebel did not care about the authoritative claims that fulfilling the general's demands was physically impossible. For him, the word impossible was simply a loud marker of the place where the real work of a brilliant engineer actually begins. His rocky path to this historical moment was paved with the most brutal failures and crushing rejections that would have easily broken any other top-class specialist. His first carrier-based project was disdainfully thrown back at him by angry naval bosses, and the second project failed miserably during official government testing. Any normal, rational person would have completely given up, but definitely not this obsessed fanatic of the wooden drafting board. He turned every harsh rejection into high-octane rocket fuel for his inhuman determination, methodically dismantling every metal detail down to the smallest atoms. He relentlessly sought the absolute flawless balance between maximum speed, weight, and extreme maneuverability, stopping at absolutely no barriers. This refers to that exceptionally rare breed of fanatical creators for whom concrete dead ends simply do not exist, but only new doors that have not yet been forcibly opened. When he bravely accepted this insane assignment of 1937, his body simply could not withstand the monstrous daily strain. The eminent doctor's diagnosis sounded like an unconditional, harsh sentence: severe exhaustion, a deep nervous breakdown, and an urgent recommendation of absolute rest to avoid a truly tragic finale. The medical staff categorically forbade him to even think about engineering work, directly threatening fatal consequences for his critically tormented body. But how can you possibly keep a man in a hospital bed when he has already clearly seen the exact contours of the perfect aerial machine inside his vivid imagination? Colleagues who came to visit him in the ward with sinking hearts froze on the threshold in a state of utter, paralyzing shock. Instead of an obedient and quiet patient, they saw a wild creator who, having placed a stiff pillow firmly under his aching back, was furiously drawing new bold lines on paper. On his small bedside table, proudly towering among the glass jars of medicines, lay a wooden slide rule, and the entire floor of the hospital ward was thickly littered with crumpled sheets of ruined mathematical calculations. The most formidable and technically perfect fighter aircraft of the coming decade was born not in bright and sterile design bureaus, but right on the rumpled sheets of a narrow hospital bed. Horikoshi constantly balanced on the very brink of complete physical exhaustion, but his inflamed mind worked with a frightening, truly supernatural clarity. He did not look for pathetic excuses and did not waste precious time thinking about why the Imperial fleet demanded the completely impossible. His brain generated only one burning question around the clock: how to remove one more extra kilogram of weight without losing a single drop of structural strength. This refers to the absolute concentrated madness of a true genius who places his great mission far above his own physical existence. When his young assistants brought stacks of papers to the ward screaming that physics simply did not allow the planned idea to be fully realized, he calmly sent them back without hesitation. In a hoarse, broken voice, he loudly ordered them to look for hidden reserves, to squeeze tiny millimeters and grams out of every component until the impossible began to take real steel shape. He charged his exhausted team with such a wild, primal energy that they quickly returned to their drafting tables and worked genuine technological miracles with their own hands. Could an ordinary, well-fed bureaucrat of engineering ever create a combat machine that was an entire historical era ahead of its time? Of course not. Such a phenomenal technological leap required exactly this kind of stubborn fanatic, completely ready to sacrifice himself for the grand triumph of metal and human thought. Horikoshi literally soldered his own nervous system deeply into the blueprints of the future fighter, creating not just a highly maneuverable aircraft, but a steel extension of pure human will. And it is exactly this frantic, blind obsession of a single engineer that would eventually make the rest of the world shudder with cold terror and boundless admiration. His deep eyes, sunken and darkened from chronic multi-day sleep deprivation, burned with a fierce, feverish fire every single time he grasped another brilliant technical solution. He immediately rejected any cowardly compromises with harsh reality, ruthlessly striking established rules and old dogmas from his working notebooks. He understood with crystal clarity that the chance to create something so grandiose falls to a person only once in his entire life, and to miss this moment would be a terrible betrayal of his own talent. In this cramped hospital room, to the monotonous ticking of the old wall clock, step by step, an absolute technological supremacy was being heavily forged that would very soon tear the skies over half the globe to shreds. When, on April 1st, 1939, the prototype of the future legendary fighter first lifted off the ground, the specialists present at the airfield froze in complete stupor. Test pilot Katsuzo Shima, after landing, stepped out of the cockpit and kept a deathly silence for a long time, as if unable to find the words to describe the experience he had just lived. Finally, he uttered a phrase that has forever entered aviation history. "This machine is flown as if it were reading the pilot's thoughts." At that moment, it became finally clear that Jiro Horikoshi had succeeded in doing the impossible and embodying in metal what was considered the limit of any designer's dreams. Let us unravel what this magic was woven from, which turned an ordinary aircraft into a deadly weapon that had no equal in the skies of the Pacific Ocean. The combat configuration of the Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighter weighed only about 2,700 kilograms, which is comparable in its parameters to the mass of a modern massive mid-range SUV. Imagine for a moment such an incredible picture: a common road vehicle that suddenly gains the ability to reach speeds exceeding 500 kilometers per hour and stays in the air for 8 hours in a row. For the aviation of the early 40s, this figure was simply beyond reality, because the overwhelming majority of fighters of those years ran out of steam after just 1.5 or 2 hours of active flight. This refers to the very essence of Horikoshi's engineering genius, who turned his fighter into a strategic tool of an absolutely different level. The flight range of the Zero allowed it to freely take off from Tokyo and reach almost to Vladivostok, returning to base on fuel reserves, which was an unattainable dream for competitors. But exactly how did he achieve such a striking result without having super powerful power plants at his disposal? The secret of success lay in an uncompromising fight for every single gram of weight and in the search for new, radical solutions in materials science. The key link in this chain of innovation was the newest aluminum alloy, developed by engineers at Sumitomo Corporation specifically for the project's needs. This material, named Extra Super Duralumin, or simply ESD, was a full third lighter than the traditional aviation aluminum of that time, while retaining phenomenal strength. Horikoshi implemented this secret alloy everywhere. It was used in the load-bearing wing spars, in the fuselage frames, and even in the most insignificant details, which were made from significantly heavier metals on the aircraft of other powers. Every saved kilogram was melted into fuel reserves, into flight range, or into additional ammunition, turning into pure combat efficiency. The second magic ingredient of the Zero lay in its wing, the area of which was much larger than any other fighter of that era. It was this design decision that provided the machine with fantastic lift at low speeds and allowed it to perform incredible turns in the air. Where Allied aircraft were already stalling, losing control, the Japanese fighter continued to hang in space, gracefully completing its maneuver. The wingtips were made foldable, which became an elegant response to the problem of limited hangar space on aircraft carrier decks, ensuring compactness during storage. The heart of the machine, the Nakajima Sakai radial engine, possessed 14 cylinders and an air cooling system, producing about 1,000 horsepower. This was not the limit of technical achievements of that time, but in perfect combination with an extremely light airframe, the motor was quite enough to accelerate the machine faster than most of its opposing targets. Horikoshi was creating not just an aircraft, but a system where every node worked at the limit of its capabilities, but exactly for one thing: the pure art of flight. He cut off everything unnecessary, everything that did not contribute to achieving the goal, leaving only a bare frame of efficiency, covered with the thin skin of the lightest aluminum. It is precisely this engineering minimalism that made the Zero the very formidable weapon that made the whole world shudder. Its design was subordinated to one single philosophy: maximum result with minimum consumption of resources. In this machine, there is not a single extra rivet connection, not a single detail that does not have a direct purpose for increasing combat characteristics. This was a triumph of engineering discipline and dedication to an idea embodied in metal, which would soon paint the skies in the colors of a great empire. But there existed a third secret that transformed Horikoshi's design work into an act of genuine samurai madness, shocking any Western specialist. To achieve an absolute, practically divine level of maneuverability and squeeze every drop of potential out of the engine, the engineer took a step that would have made people in decent design bureaus in London or Washington simply faint. He ruthlessly, methodically, and absolutely consciously threw out of the blueprints everything that was traditionally considered vital for the survival of the crew. Horikoshi dealt a powerful blow to the established canons of aviation, forever crossing out the very idea of pilot safety as the main priority of design. He personally struck from the specifications the heavy steel armor plate intended to protect the pilot from bullets flying from the rear hemisphere in the heat of a fierce battle. Moreover, he refused to install self-sealing fuel tanks, which in Western machines were covered with a special self-sealing layer of rubber that instantly blocked any punctures. Any projectile hitting the machine turned the inside of the fighter into a flaming hell, but the designer was absolutely unyielding in his radical decision. This was not a random error, not a consequence of a lack of materials, and certainly not a banal negligence, as some detractors tried to claim. It was a cold, calculated, and deeply philosophical choice of a man who sincerely believed in the superiority of the spirit over cold steel. This refers to the very essence of the Japanese military ideology of those years, where any aspiration for additional protection was perceived as weakness and cowardice, unworthy of a noble warrior. In this coordinate system, a pilot who desperately needs armored plates behind his back admits his own imperfection in advance and his readiness to make a fatal mistake. A true master, in Horikoshi's opinion, is obliged to possess his machine so masterfully that not a single enemy bullet has even a theoretical chance of touching its streamlined fuselage. Protection was recognized as the lot of those who do not trust their own skill, and for the Japanese military elite, this was an absolutely unacceptable humiliation. Imagine this contrast. While American and European designers painfully racked their brains over how to increase the thickness of armored plates without a significant loss in flight data, the Japanese intentionally made their machines extremely vulnerable. They turned the pilot into a fragile, expendable, but incredibly skillful instrument of war, who had to either completely destroy the enemy or perish, having not a single chance for salvation. It was a deadly compromise that made the fighter legendarily fast and lightweight, but at the same time doomed it to the role of a torch in the skies at the very first successful hit by an enemy. In 1939, when the first prototypes were just being tested, no one in the world realized the full terrifying tragedy of this engineering choice. All experts of those years unanimously admired the incredible ease of control and fantastic maneuverability of the Zero, not guessing that these qualities were paid for by the absence of protection. Horikoshi created not just an aircraft, he created a technological manifesto asserting that attack is the only and most reliable form of defense. However, for this audacious postulate, pilots had to pay with their own lives at the moment when the reality of war turned out to be much more cruel and bloody than any theoretical calculations. It was a beautiful, mesmerizing, and extremely dangerous idea, which in peacetime looked like a triumph of reason, but in the conditions of real battle turned into a cruel trap for people. Conscious vulnerability became the stigma of this project, which sooner or later had to manifest itself at the most inopportune moment when the enemy would learn to use the weak points. But so far, the aircraft was surrounded by an aura of invincibility, and no one dared to criticize such a radical engineering philosophy that brought the Empire the status of mistress of the skies. The designer took this risk with wide-open eyes, perfectly understanding that every extra detail of armor steals precious fractions of a second from the pilot in a deadly turn. He put everything on the line, betting on the skill of a man who had to be faster, more accurate, and more aggressive than any opponent met in the vast expanses of the ocean. August of 1940 became the point of no return. The day when an event occurred in the skies over the flame-engulfed Chinese city of Chongqing that forever changed the history of air warfare. 13 Japanese fighters, whose smooth, hitherto unseen silhouettes with large wings merged with the dazzling light of the sun, suddenly fell upon an unsuspecting group of adversaries. Chinese pilots rose to meet them in proven Soviet-made fighter models I-15 and I-16. Machines that by that time had already earned a formidable reputation as reliable and dangerous combatants. It seemed that experience and time-tested equipment should have held the sky, but reality turned into an absolute nightmare that defied all logic. The battle, if this bloody massacre could even be called that, ended in just a few minutes, leaving behind only pillars of black smoke and debris falling to the ground. All 13 Chinese aircraft were destroyed with jewelry-like precision, turned into a pile of mangled metal, while the Japanese squadron did not lose a single machine. Moreover, there was not a single scratch on the skin of the 13 Japanese fighters, not a single hit from a stray bullet. This was not just technical superiority. It was a total, humiliating suppression of the adversary that baffled even the most hardened experts. This refers to those very scary statistical anomalies where dry figures like 12-0 or 13-0 scream about the impending collapse of an entire regional security system. Surviving Chinese pilots, in a state of severe shock, tried to explain to the command what had happened in the air, but their words sounded like the ravings of madmen. With trembling voices, they told how the Japanese fighter appeared out of nowhere, performing incredible maneuvers that, according to all the laws of aerodynamics, simply could not exist. While you were only starting your turn, he was already unfathomably in your sights, turning your life into dust in a fraction of a second. Soviet military advisors present in China immediately sent a detailed, literally minute-by-minute report to Moscow, describing the tactics, flight technical characteristics, and the frightening behavior of the mysterious aircraft. In this document, it was written in black and white that the adversary had created something fundamentally new, against which old combat methods no longer worked. This text was carefully read in high offices. They nodded their heads importantly, took it into account, and simply put it aside without making a single concrete conclusion. Systemic inertia turned out to be stronger than reality, and the mysterious Zero continued its deadly hunt, remaining in the eyes of the leadership only a local nuisance. Information about these events gradually seeped into the West, reaching the ears of those who were obligated to know the truth about what was happening on the other side of the world. The American military attaché in China, Captain Claire Chennault, was not just a desk official, but an experienced pilot who had smelled gunpowder and was not prone to panic or exaggeration. He wrote a most detailed report in which he provided all available data, a description of the turns, the firepower of the new Japanese cannons, and the tactical flexibility of the adversary. The captain's warning was extremely direct and harsh. This aircraft poses a critical threat. One must prepare for it in advance while there is still time. But this document suffered the same fate as all previous alarms. He was solemnly thanked for his service and safely tucked away in a dusty cabinet. Why did this happen? A question to which one can give only a bitter and painful answer today, connected with the very essence of human thinking. Japan, in many influential offices in Washington and London, was still lazily considered a second-tier power whose aviation was just a pathetic derivative of European models. Generals simply could not admit the thought that Asian amateurs were capable of creating a masterpiece that would make their own design bureaus look like a gathering of second-rate artisans. This refers to the classic paradox of bureaucratic psychology. It is much easier for a person to ignore an obvious threat than to admit their own incompetence and lack of preparation for a global challenge. In 1940, the Allies had enough other worries. Europe was burning, the Atlantic was under threat, and the Pacific seemed like a distant and secondary theater of military operations. People who could have read these documents and saved thousands of lives were busy with other, more important things, closing their eyes to the impending storm. This was not just blindness. This was criminal overconfidence, for which one subsequently had to pay the highest price. December of 1941 forever entered history as the moment when the habitual world of Allied pilots collapsed under the pressure of an invisible and hitherto incomprehensible threat. The Pacific Ocean, which just yesterday seemed like a safe space, turned into a trap where every takeoff could be the last. United States and British pilots, rising into the air from aircraft carrier decks or coastal airfields, hoped for their superiority, but the encounter with the Zero instantly dispelled all their illusions. What they saw in the sky had nothing to do with the forecasts of headquarters strategists or the reports of pre-war intelligence officers. The first reports arriving at the command's desk were permeated with a state close to deep, paralyzing shock. Pilots described the same thing. You see the enemy, make a decision to attack, begin a maneuver, and suddenly, in a fraction of a second, he is not where he should be, but right behind your back. American pilot John Thack, whose experience was indisputable, later recalled with bitterness, "I was doing everything right, strictly following the instructions from the manual, but this Japanese pilot had a completely different manual." In a maneuverable battle, the Zero was practically invulnerable to the first-generation fighters that the Allies encountered at the beginning of the Pacific Campaign. The Brewster Buffalo, Curtiss P-40, and Grumman F-4F Wildcat aircraft, which were considered quite worthy machines, suddenly turned out to be helpless flying targets. They were hopelessly inferior to the Japanese fighter in everything: in turn radius, in rate of climb, and in maneuverability at medium altitudes. This relates to the most acute psychological breakdown that Allied flight units ever experienced during the entire Second World War. Pilots tried any tactical approaches. They tried to attack from above in a dive, hoping to use accumulated energy, but only a few managed to catch the moment for a strike. The command reacted lightning fast, but this reaction was dictated not by a desire to find an answer, but by a dry admission of its own helplessness. An official, strictest order was issued. Categorically, do not engage in a maneuverable battle with the Zero under any circumstances. Think about this. An official document, signed by the highest officer staff, admits that an attempt to conduct a fair duel with the enemy will lead to a guaranteed defeat. Imagine yourself in the place of a young pilot who reads this order before a flight into a combat zone. You climb into the cockpit, start the engine, and realize that somewhere out there, in the boundless blue, flies a machine with which you are strictly forbidden to fight directly. This pressed on the psyche with incredible force. generating a depressing feeling of inferiority and fear. American and British pilots dashed about, trying to find a way to turn the situation around, tried pair attacks, altitude echeloning, and hit-and-run tactics, but most often it ended in another loss. They returned again and again to the same conclusion. On equal terms, in a fair competition, this aircraft was absolutely invincible. The problem was also that the Allies had no technical documentation, no captured specimens to study to understand the design secrets of the Zero. All that was on hand were fragmentary reports from pilots and scattered wreckage, which gave only a distorted representation of reality.
Horikoshi, creating his masterpiece, found the ideal balance, which in the conditions of the early 40s seemed like magic. But while Allied pilots lived under the yoke of official bans, fear became their constant companion, paralyzing the will to fight and turning every flight into a lottery with death. This psychological paralysis of the command was worse than any losses, because it undermined the confidence in victory from within, showing that there is a force capable of dictating its own terms on the battlefield. June of 1942 turned the gray, unwelcoming outskirts of the world into an arena where the fate of the entire Pacific theater of military operations was being decided. The Aleutian Islands, this endless chain of scraps of land lost between Alaska and Japan, were shrouded in thick, impenetrable fog, which swallowed sounds and hid any secrets. Japanese aviation, not leaving attempts to pressure American bases in this remote sector, regularly launched audacious strikes, using the harsh climate as its cover. It was here, during a routine raid, that fate presented the Allies with a gift the likes of which had not been seen throughout the history of global confrontation. One of the Japanese fighters received a regrettable damage in battle that did not seem critical, but the engine began to betrayingly sputter, losing RPMs right above the icy waters. 20-year-old pilot Tadayoshi Koga, despite his young age, was considered one of the most promising and experienced pilots in the squadron, but even his skill could not save the wounded machine in such a critical situation. He made the decision to land on a flat area that seemed like a reliable meadow from the air, but in fact turned out to be a cursed, viscous swamp on Akuten Island. Japanese pilots had long ago agreed among themselves that it was here, in case of an accident, that they would try to land in the hope of being saved by their rescue groups. The aircraft's landing gear touched the ground, but instead of solid soil, it was met by treacherous swamp muck, which instantly became the grave for the fragile fighter. The landing gear struts went into the soft ground, and in the next instant, the Zero, by inertia, made a terrible flip over its nose, freezing upside down in the sticky mud. The pilot died on the spot, and his combat machine, hidden by fog and swamp grass, remained lying in an untouched state at the very edge of the earth, where no one was looking for it. Long weeks passed, and only in July, a random American patrol scout flying at low altitude caught a glimpse of something abnormal among the swamp greenery. The silhouette was so unusual and alien to this wild landscape that the pilot made a second turn, then a third, and finally realized before him lay not a wreck, but an almost intact enemy aircraft. This relates to the most incredible irony of history, when the outcome of the greatest conflict is decided not in meeting halls, but because of an annoying technical malfunction in a remote swamp. The coordinates were immediately transmitted to the base, and the command reacted with such speed that it was not dreamed of, even in the most successful operations. A team of specialists was equipped for the island, who with difficulty made their way to the crash site, expecting to see a pile of mangled scrap. But what appeared before their eyes shocked them. The aircraft was lying upside down, submerged in muck up to the cockpit, but its main nodes and aggregates were almost intact. One short message, sent from the island to Washington, made the headquarters generals forget about their uniforms and solidity. Damage is minimal, the machine is fully suitable for restoration. In the American capital, these words were read while standing, perfectly realizing that just now a key to destroying the invincible Japanese ghost had fallen into their hands. The Zero, with the greatest precautions, was evacuated from the swamp, delivered to the base in San Diego, and locked in a hangar to which only the chosen few had access. Japanese identification marks were diligently painted over, and the cream of all American aviation engineering was gathered around the machine, ready to proceed to the most detailed and merciless autopsy in history. The methodicalness with which the work was conducted bordered on religious fanaticism, because the future strategy of conducting the war in the ocean depended on every single screw. Each detail was carefully photographed, measured with micrometers, weighed on ultra-precise scales, and described in thick reports that later lay on the desks of designers of new American fighters. Engineers studied the skin material, the design of control nodes, the fuel tank system, and all those nuances that made this machine so fast and deadly. And the more they delved into the anatomy of the Japanese miracle, the quieter it became in the hangar as the picture began to fold into a single whole, shattering all habitual ideas about what was possible. This relates to the moment of highest professional insight, when an engineer realizes that his adversary did not use magic, but was simply much braver and more daring. All that aura of mystery surrounding the Zero during the last year began to rapidly evaporate, giving way to cold calculation and a clear understanding of the weak points. The Americans realized that the Japanese had not invented super-secret technologies. They had simply taken a risk from which all other designers of the world retreated in fear. After the machine was restored and lifted into the air, Lieutenant Melvin Holmes, an outstanding test pilot, put it through all flight regimes, writing into history a final verdict for Japanese engineering art. When the finest aviation minds of the United States of America began the total deconstruction of the trophy seized in the Aleutian Islands, they expected to see something supernatural. In the corridors of secret San Diego laboratories, rumors swirled that the Japanese had made a fundamental breakthrough in metallurgy, implemented unthinkable aerodynamic schemes, or built an engine that violated the laws of thermodynamics. Leading designers from the country's top corporations gathered in the hangar like priests before dissecting a sacred idol, expecting to find magic hidden from human eyes. They methodically, centimeter by centimeter, opened the fuselage, preparing to be amazed by the brilliance of the Eastern masters, but with each new disassembled node, their faces became more puzzled, and an oppressive, almost palpable silence reigned in the hangar. Instead of the expected extraterrestrial technologies and revolutionary solutions, they discovered something far more shocking, absolute, bordering on madness, engineering audacity that any Western specialist would simply not have had the courage to pursue. The engineers discovered that the Japanese had not created anything fundamentally new. They had simply pushed to the absolute limit those methods that in America were considered categorically unacceptable for reasons of safety and common sense. Every detail, every frame, every centimeter of aluminum skin was stripped of the slightest hint of redundancy, which Western bureaucrats were accustomed to calling a necessary safety margin. This was not a miracle. It was a calculation imbued with a desperate determination to create a machine capable of surpassing everyone, even at the cost of the pilot's life. The Americans weighed every screw, measured the thickness of the metal with micrometers, and recorded the indicators in thick reports that became a real revelation for the country's military leadership. They realized that the Japanese bluff lay in the very concept of the Zero. It seemed like an invincible ghost only because it was created to perform a narrowly specialized task, discarding any attempts to sit on two chairs at once. When the restored and repainted fighter first took to the air under the control of Lieutenant Melvin Holmes, the true nature of the threat finally became obvious. Holmes, having put the Japanese machine through all imaginable and unimaginable flight regimes, returned to the airfield with a clear understanding of how to destroy this hitherto untouchable myth. He found what in dry reports were called blind spots, although it would be more correct to call them fundamental limitations of the samurai philosophy itself. At high speeds, the Japanese fighters' elevators and rudder became monstrously heavy, depriving the aircraft of its main trump card, its phenomenal maneuverability. Holmes clearly saw that in a dive, the Zero shows a dangerous tendency toward instability, and that with a sharp increase in speed, its design begins to work at the limit of its capabilities. While Japanese engineers prided themselves on their ability to lighten the machine, they did not even realize that this very decision became its main Achilles heel in the hands of an adversary who knows the rules of the game. This relates to that very turning point when the enemy's engineering superiority ceases to be magic and turns into a set of quite concrete, eliminable technical parameters. American designers received a priceless roadmap in their hands, in which it was written in black and white exactly where to attack, which flight regimes are destructive for the enemy, and how to use their own overconfidence against them. The entire aura of invincibility created by Japanese propaganda over 2 years collapsed overnight as soon as this knowledge seeped into the squadrons. Now, the American aviation industry faced a concrete, tangible task: to build an aircraft that would not just be better than the Zero, but one that would use its design features as a lever for complete destruction. The contrast between the expectation of encountering a technological miracle and the harsh, grounded reality found in the hangar became the very cold shower that the Allies desperately needed. They realized that the Great Zero was just a brilliant but extremely fragile compromise created in conditions of extreme resource scarcity and faith in the uniqueness of their own spirit. Now that the secret of Japanese audacity had been uncovered, only one thing remained: to set up an assembly line that would turn this audacity into a pile of mangled aluminum at the bottom of the ocean. The American industry, working at a frantic speed, received the clearest engineering order in its entire history, and there was no turning back for the Japanese Empire. The philosophy that Jiro Horikoshi embedded in the design of his fighter ultimately became the very trap that slammed shut over the fate of all Japanese aviation. What looked like a triumph of engineering thought and a symbol of absolute dominance in 1939 turned into a ruthless verdict by 43. The absence of armor plates and self-sealing fuel tanks, which were initially positioned as a sign of elitism and skill, turned into catastrophic losses. American pilots, having analyzed the vulnerabilities of the captured machine, began to use a tactic called hit and run, which left the Japanese not the slightest chance for salvation. No dogfights or prolonged turns where the Zero was invincible, only a swift dive from above, a short, aimed burst, and a lightning-fast retreat at high speed. This refers to that critical moment when an advanced technology suddenly becomes obsolete because the surrounding world has changed the rules of the game. John Thack, whose legendary Thack-Weave maneuver became a nightmare for Japanese aces, developed a simple but devilishly effective combat geometry. Two fighters, moving in pairs and constantly crossing each other's courses, created a situation for the attacking Zero in which he himself was instantly in the crosshairs. This elementary tactic devalued all the maneuverable advantages of the Japanese fighter overnight. And then, new American hunters entered the arena: the Hellcat and the Corsair, machines that were created with a single goal: to purposefully and cold-bloodedly destroy the Zero in the skies. The new American fighters possessed engines with 2,000 horsepower, which was twice the potential of their Japanese opponent, and could leave it behind in any vertical maneuver. Horikoshi, seeing the catastrophe unfolding, feverishly tried to save his creation, releasing modifications with reinforced weaponry and the addition of partial armor. However, every such design change became another nail in the coffin of the ideal balance for which he had once sacrificed protection. Installing armor inevitably led to a sharp loss of maneuverability, and a more powerful engine catastrophically made the airframe heavier, depriving the aircraft of its main trump card, its phenomenal flight range. This relates to the tragic logic of an engineering compromise. When you try to forcibly adapt a design that was perfect for its time to changed realities, you inevitably destroy the very essence of that perfection. The Zero, with increased mass, was no longer that legendary predator. It became an overloaded, clumsy imitation of itself. But the main tragedy was not even the aircraft itself, but the exhaustion of the Japanese Army's personnel reserve. Experienced pilots, who had gone through the crucible of the Chinese campaigns and knew how to squeeze the last percentages of its capabilities out of the Zero, were almost completely wiped out during endless battles. Their places in the cockpits were taken by young cadets who had several times fewer flight hours than their predecessors. The assembly line of Japanese aircraft factories continued to work at the limit, stamping out thousands of aircraft, which in the hands of inexperienced youths turned into real burning traps. By 1944, the situation became completely absurd. The Japanese industry continued to produce the Zero only because the production of new, more modern and powerful fighters required technologies that the country no longer possessed. The perfected assembly line for the Zero issued thousands of machines, knowing every rivet, but these apparatuses were doomed. An aircraft created for a virtuoso did not forgive mistakes to novices, becoming for them a sure path to doom in the flames of punctured tanks. This was the finale of a great era, where technical elegance proved unable to withstand brute force, mass production, and the inevitable course of history. Jiro Horikoshi lived to see the end of that terrible war that turned his country into smoldering ruins. The man whose name thundered in the offices of admirals now sat in the silence of an emptied office, surrounded by yellowed sheets of blueprints that were never destined to become reality. The aircraft that once ruled the boundless expanses of the ocean now became only ghosts of the past, forever vanished into the abyss of history. What did this genius feel in those hours, whose creation simultaneously brought delight to millions and became an instrument of unspeakable tragedy for countless multitudes of people? One can only guess at the weight of these thoughts because after the end of the war, the Japanese aviation industry was forbidden from engaging in any development for many years. Horikoshi was left only to teach, write memoirs, and endlessly reflect on what was done correctly and what turned into an irreparable mistake. In 1956, he published a book titled Technical and Personal Report on the Creation of the Zero, where, without any heroization, in dry and honest language, he laid out the chronicle of his great path. Each technical decision, each forced compromise, each painful choice, all of this was laid out on paper with frightening frankness. In the concluding chapters, he asked himself and the readers a question to which he never found a clear, calming answer in his entire life. He asked if it was correct, not from the point of view of an engineer striving for ideal forms or a military strategist counting victories and losses. His question concerned the very essence of human existence, what it means to create something perfect, to see how this perfection is used in a way you did not plan at all, and to become an involuntary participant in history you never chose. There is no answer in this book, only an endless question hanging in the air like smoke over a cooled-down ash heap. Today, only a few flight-worthy examples of this once formidable fighter remain in the whole world, and they are protected like the greatest relics, like a reminder of the limits of human possibilities. One such aircraft rests in a museum in Alaska, not far from the very place where in 1942 a downed Japanese trophy was found, opening the Allies' eyes to the truth. If you are ever lucky enough to see a flying Zero in real life at an aviation holiday, just stop for a moment. Look carefully not at this cold piece of aluminum, but at the idea itself that it embodies. Before you, is a materialized answer to the question, how far can a person go in their obsessed pursuit of perfection, and what an exorbitant price this very perfection sometimes demands from its creator. Horikoshi passed away in 1982 in Tokyo, having lived 78 years, and his last note was a short entry about the aviation of the future. Until his last breath, he thought about balance, trying to find harmony between cold calculation and human will. Let us return for a moment to where we began our long story.
An operator of a radar station, tensely peering into a screen where glowing dots designate aircraft flying from the open ocean. In those days, they arrived from where, according to all calculations, it was physically impossible to arrive from. Now you know for sure that they were not ghosts and not equipment failures, but the result of the work of one single person who, in 1937, lay in a hospital with a ruler in his hands and refused to believe in the word impossible. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero is one of the rarest examples in aviation history of how a machine changes not only military tactics, but also how people think about design, risks, and the price of success. Think about this from this angle. Every modern designer, every person creating something complex, sooner or later faces this fateful choice. One can do it reliably, safely, and correctly, but without a spark of genius, or one can do it brilliantly, but dangerously, risking everything. Most choose the first path, and that is reasonable, but it is precisely those who choose the second who create milestones in the progress of humanity. Horikoshi created something that the world had not seen before him and would not see for a long time after, and that is worth remembering his name for. Perfection is an incredibly fragile thing, and not at all eternal, because the world moves forward, leaving behind what seemed like the pinnacle of technology yesterday. The Zero was ideal for its historical moment, absolutely without any reservations, but time is an inexorable element that spares neither people nor their creations. He sought his balance all his life, the balance between speed and weight, between protection and range, and he found it so accurately that the whole world felt the power of this decision. This is the main lesson of the Zero, not technical and not military, but purely human. When one person, armed only with a pencil and absolute faith, changes the whole world's perception of what engineering thought is capable of, it remains in the ages forever. His name does not thunder in the squares, but every time you see a modern fighter, remember that the very question that Horikoshi asked himself in a hospital ward lives in its genes. Thank you for walking this path with me to the very end, because if this story truly hooked you, you already know what needs to be done. See you in the next issues, where we will raise even more forgotten secrets from the archives. If this excursion into the closed archives has made you look at the history of engineering genius in a new way, do not let this story get lost in the stream of content. Your like is a signal to the algorithms that such deep analysis is truly needed. Click on subscribe and be sure to turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next dive into the secrets that are usually kept silent. We will continue to break the seals on forgotten documents and get to the very core of the technological breakthroughs of the past. See you in the next episodes, where there will be even more dangerous truth.